didn't acknowledge my own rules.
That's okay.
I was handed that as I walked in.
Not to worry. Do you have anything that you need to do? Otherwise, I'm happy to just start.
No, I need to make an announcement.
Okay.
Are there still people out there?
Robin, they'll hear your voice and start.
Sorry?
We should just start. They'll hear your voice because we've also got a fire alarm in place.
Okay. Yeah. Welcome everyone to the third final day of the summit. So welcome to everyone on this International Women's Day, of course. So that's an important day. Just a warning that there will be a fire alarm test at 9:30. You don't have to leave, stay in your seats. It'll last a few minutes. I'm sorry about that. Whoever's speaking, you'll be interrupted by that. And then just to say, introduce the session, which is this session on civil society and human genome editing, roles and challenges of public engagement. And the moderator is Francis Baylis. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. And I, too, was going to start by reminding us that it's International Women's Day. And I expect a loud round of applause, given that I'm a woman saying this. There you go. Anyhow, for those of you who know my work in this area around heritable genome editing, one of the things that I've repeatedly emphasized is that this is not just about tissues. It's actually research that involves women. And so in that context, I think it's also important that it overlaps with the topics that we'll be covering today. The session today is about public engagement, and the challenge set for the speakers in this panel was threefold. I asked them, what is it that makes for good, effective public engagement? And I think that's a difficult and challenging question in a global context. Also, who is the public that you're trying to engage? So we talk about public engagement, but do we have a common understanding of who we think the public is? And in that context, what are some of the challenges that we face? So what you have here is a slide that represents the panelists, and part of the reason for that is, like many other sessions before this, we're trying to maximize time available both to the speakers and for Q&A. So I will not go through their biographies. They're available to you in the package that you received. The one thing I will draw your attention to is you should all have received this URL in an email, and it provides you with a permanent record or of a description of each of these organizations. But for those of you who may not have received that email or who don't have it ready to hand, it's there for a few seconds. You can otherwise Google it and have a written description of each person. Again, I just want to say we'll be taking questions at the end of the session, and in that context, please use the microphones. And for those of you who are online, please use Slido. Those of you in the room can also use Slido, of course, and think about what it is you'd like to upvote. And with that, I invite our first speaker, Luis.
So good morning, everyone, and happy Women's Day. Talking about public engagement, so I'd like to thank first the organizers. This has been a very diverse and intense meeting, one of the most diverse meetings I ever attended, so that's good. If we would go on the street and we would be asking people, what do you think about human genome editing? Well, I would say many people will say, what are you talking about? Some people might say, well, you shouldn't be doing this. This is evil. This is playing God. And hopefully some will say, maybe this is bringing some hope to people with congenital diseases that have actually no cure. And this is why we constituted ARISH. ARISH stands for the Associations for Responsible Research and Innovation in Genome Editing. It is an NGO. is a non-for-profit association. We registered in France with an international scope. And it is made by people like me. I'm a researcher, I'm a geneticist, I'm a happy user of CRISPR tools. I'm making mice that are carrying patient mutations, and I try to investigate with them a rare disease. But I have an interest in ethics, and this is what is shared along with the rest of people in the world, which have been elected democratically by our members. And that includes Hervé Nivaise, that was at the committee, that Catherine was presented yesterday from the WHO. It includes also Jennifer Meshan, that you saw her sharing yesterday the session. She was involved in the 2017 National Academy of Science report, and includes Vongi Shosi from South Africa, that he was part of the study that was presented yesterday by Piers Millet, and Julian Kinderer, that was member of the European Groups of Ethics. So what do we care about? So we care about this dissemination of reliable information about genome editing to everyone in the society. François was asking who is the public to engage with. Well, this is everyone, and this includes our colleagues and researchers, but also researchers in life science, but also in social science, but also regulatory agencies, patient groups, and lay people in the street. We're fostering the development of genome editing technologies. We're pushing forward reflections at different levels. And we're also promoting and understanding that this is a difficult task, global governance. So we don't have much money. So we only have the money on the membership fees of the about 100 members that we have, plus about 500 community members that are following what we do, and you are all welcome. And I believe a number of you are also associated with ARISH at this point. And even though we don't have much funds, I believe we have been doing rather well. We have compensated this with enthusiasm and with volunteer tasks on the top of what everybody else is doing. We have been focusing our attention in the global south. So it's similar to this conference. We have an interest to reach out to people in Africa, people in Southern Asia, and also people in South America. So I'm glad to see representatives of all these different parts in this conference too. We have so far either organized or been participating in 8 different meetings covering all different subjects on genome editing. So of course, we care about human genome editing, but we are also caring about the biotechnological applications for plant and animal genome editing, and including genome and gene drive applications. We had several statements that have been published on gene drives, on human genome editing at the germline status, and also on plant genome editing in Europe, that you know is a challenging issue. And we have produced several newsletters on different subjects, including this gene drive, including the use of genome editing in animal biotechnology, and the clinical applications of these techniques. So last but not least, I'm pleased to say that we have collaborated with the rest of the people. We haven't collaborated yet with the SAMA, but I'm sure that we will find a way to collaborate. We have collaborated with the Global Observatory, and we have collaborated with the Global Citizen Assembly. Actually, our last newsletter is devoted to present some cases of this Global Assembly. Yesterday, I attended the Global Observatory. And also, we have collaborated with initiatives that are not represented here, like the Genome Writers Guild from the US or the Japanese Society of Genome Editing. So basically, I think we all agree and we all care about trying to transmit the benefits, but also the limitations of genome editing to the public. And with that, I finish. Thank you.
My thanks also to Robin and to the other organizers of the International Summit. It's a huge pleasure and an honor to be given a slot to be talking about the Global Observatory for Genome Editing. We're a somewhat smaller organization than ARIGE, but I want to name my two co-directors, Ben Hurlbut and Chris Saha, and also the two postdoctoral fellows that we have who helped us organize the parallel session that we had last night on modes of inclusion. So I think that, as Luis has already said, the important thing to understand about these different organizational ways of broadening the debate around genome editing and other technologies that have the capacity to alter human nature is that these are complementary efforts. And I think that goes to the central question or questions that Francoise has already put on the table. What is the public? Well, the public is indeed all of us, or we all, or we the people, or however one wants to think about it. And if that is a global public, then there is no way in which a single organization or a single way of approaching what is at stake could possibly begin to address the totality of the discussions. People often like to say that this is the beginning of a scientific revolution. It is, in any case, a matter of convergent technologies, and we're seeing movements forward in the biological sciences that are, in a way, being amplified and pushed forward by developments in the information sciences and technologies, and the 21st century will look like a different century than the 20th century. So there is a kind of secondary scientific revolution, if you will, or technological revolution underway, and how the global public is going to respond to that is not an overnight thing. So these are cracks in the system through which these different organizations are trying to make a difference by energizing some modes of thinking more than some publics, in a sense. So whereas ARIGE is led by people who are, as Luis pointed out, at the front lines of doing research in the very fields that are represented, for instance, in this institution, our focus in the observatory has been in the tacit human of the genome editing enterprise. And the place where we begin is noting that the care for human life is a kind of universal. I was interested that Luis didn't say International Women's Day, he said Women's Day. And, in a way, that's a truer thing. Why stick an international in front of women? And similarly, we're talking about human life and that the caring is universal, but we already know very well that the modes and obligations for how we care for human life are not the same around the world. And this is where the observatory starts in with what we're trying to do. So we have framing questions that are about the challenges posed to all of us as humanity as we think about what these technologies are for. What these technologies can accomplish is already very clear, and we've seen some miraculous things that can be accomplished on a very spotlighted set of problems. But we're talking about a sweeping set of changes that will, by the end of the century, quite possibly alter our understandings of what human beings are for in this world. And that, of course, that is not territory for science. That is territory for all of us coming from whatever disciplines we come from, including fields like theology, certainly my own field of law. These are repositories of profound thinking about the meaning of human life. And our goal in the observatory is to broaden the discussion in order to bring in some of these perspectives that are as highly developed as any technique of human genetic engineering. So what ideas of care and flourishing are abroad in the world? How do they get embedded in the technological tools and goals? And how can we look beyond the scope of given technological systems in order to energize the debate? And to that end, the observatory has some procedural responses that I will just name here. First of all, there is a kind of codification, mapping what are the ideas that are abroad in the world around particular forms of technological breakthroughs. So for instance, what does it mean to talk about saving lives, which is certainly part of the discourse that is dominant? We have been convening conversations, and our goal is to bring together disciplines and outlooks and sectors and points of view that are not often in a room together. And here I have to give a shout out to this international summit, because it has done this kind of diversification of points of view in a more pronounced way than either of the two preceding summits. And we've done some specific workshops, such as the one around abortion that was mentioned yesterday at our parallel session. And finally, we're producing papers on ongoing developments that are at the center of the kinds of issues we're talking about, such as the debate around the 14-day rule, and some of these resources and products, which are unfortunately always slower in the pipeline than the latest technological breakthrough. You will find them on our website, and this is what we're attempting to do with that focus on caring for human life. Thank you.
Greetings all. It's a pleasure and an honour to be here, and I'd like to echo Lewis's points in terms of how impressive this event is in terms of the diversity and the scope that it's covering, and it is an honour to be able to present to you today on the Global Citizens Assembly on genome editing. My apologies, I'm going to have to go through some fairly sort of abstract and detailed territory very quickly, so I'm sorry if I'm speaking too fast and not getting into details here. In terms of quality, so what it constitutes a good sort of public engagement process, I'd also like to echo Sheila's point in terms of there's no one widget or tool technology that will do the job here. It requires a whole portfolio of approaches, not only the ones that we're speaking to, but it also includes the work that very good work, impressive work, and it was really struck me yesterday. The degree of effort that is already engaged, all the way from social scientists, philosophers, and so on, down to clinicians, and that was very impressive and heartwarming to see. So portfolio of approaches, but in terms of a deliberative, specifically deliberative lens, if you like, over what would be ideal in this space, to quote my very esteemed colleague, friend, and mentor, John Dryzek, it would involve three sort of main elements. The first one, it has a deliberative component to that. Now I'll try and actually sort of flesh out what that means as I go along, and hopefully that's clear, reasonably clear at least. It should be inclusive of all those sort of involved, concerned, affected by the technology. This isn't just sort of the patients, people, it's the wider community, both in the present and the future, and particularly in non-human applications, also non-humans as well, a way to give voice or express the interests and concerns of all those elements together as part of one sort of integrated package or whole. And it should be consequential. Now, I don't mean consequential simply in terms of dictating a particular outcome. I mean that in a fuller and wider sense in terms of actually helping to develop an understanding, not only among specialists, people in interest, but also the wider community, to find voice and express those concerns and actually translate it into norms of practice, if you like. And that's a very big ask. And again, no one tool is going to do the job there. So in terms of the, of course, the other dimension is it should be global. I really like the formulation in terms of this being a sort of dialogue with the species yesterday. So Fyodorov, if you don't mind, I might actually borrow that conceptualization of the challenge that we face here. So in terms of the Global Citizen Assembly and the key features of the design to try and do some sort of justice to these challenges, and it's a very big ask to actually do them all. A very important component of the design involves who actually comes to the process itself. One of the issues with this particular technology is there really isn't a lot of public discussion going on at present, certainly in Australia and other countries. And I can let our partners speak to other constituencies. So in terms of constituting, bringing together the public from all around the globe, We've actually built in a developmental component, if you like, through a whole suite of national partners who are running their own processes in terms of engaging the public deliberatively. So it's possible to imagine developing a voice in that sense in situ. And it really does feel a bit bizarre, the idea that you would tip someone from various corners of the world together into a process without actually having had a chance to reflect it in their own sort of space, if you like, their own context. So the idea of this design is actually to give a chance to find that voice and bring them together in a global sense afterwards. So it's a two-step process in that sense. And I sort of acknowledge partners, Jennifer Merchant and Anna Middleton, who are running their own events in France and recently in the UK. The second part of the strategy involves a standard demographic, sort of approach to stratification. But the real sort of, I guess, innovation that we like to think we bring to this is what we call a discursive approach to constituting the chamber. I can elaborate a little bit in terms of what I mean by that. But the idea of it being discursive is we're not actually representing, constituting or including sort of people, if you like. We're including ideas, the sort of hopes and concerns that we spoke about yesterday in all its full diversity. Okay, I really better get going. I've gone off script here, my apologies. Another important component is actually the input of information. We have a science documentary component to this. Our partner, Sonia Pemberton, was here a couple of years ago. You may have met her. This was actually her idea. She's actually sort of developing a documentary as part of the input. Engaging with expertise is also important, of course. In terms of the impact, the standard approach is to actually sort of influence decision-making. That doesn't really fit in this model. The idea of actually sort of having an outcome into some sort of global void, not entirely a void, is a bit problematic. Really, what our goal in this process is to actually generate a wider public discussion. So, in terms of inclusion, really the goal here is to actually, via Sonia's work in a deliberative documentary, is to scale this process up and engage a wider, ideally global public with all the potential benefits and feedbacks involved. Very quickly, discursive representation. So, this was important in the recent case study we did in Australia. These are the four sort of discourses that we sort of established via a sort of a prior baseline study. The profound concern discourse was actually very small in the Australian community. It represented a very, very small minority. And this was important in the deliberative sense. It represented those really sort of profound issues of sort of, identity and aspiration, religion, and so on, that got voice in the process and actually ended up becoming a source of criticism in the sense that there wasn't really the time to work through those issues. But at least if we, and we have to adapt and learn from that experience, but at least having established, engaged in this process of inclusion, the voice was there in some sense. Now we have to actually learn from that. Achieving at global level is another big challenge. Very, very quickly, I want to actually talk about what we mean about the public in a sort of qualitative sense, in a deliberative sense here, really, very, very quickly. So what I've got here, it reflects a goal being not an arbitrary consensus, but the idea of a mutual understanding achieved via sort of a process of deliberation. If we run a global survey, it may serve to reveal public opinion, but it doesn't actually give us the tools to understand how those values, beliefs, and so on translate into ideas of norms of practice and ideas of what should be done. This graph here, can't explain it in detail, reflects sort of a diversity, like a polarized view, if you like, a dissent in the sense, it represents pairs of individuals, the extent to which they agree on values and beliefs on the x-axis and their preferred outcomes on the y-axis. There isn't a consistency in that agreement. We have lots of disagreement down the bottom, but when we actually you dig in and understand the totality of relevant values and beliefs, there's a lot more agreement, we believe. What we have in this situation is a non-deliberative outcome in terms of poor translation of what we aspire to and what we actually choose. What deliberation does, in creating a deliberative environment, is actually correct that and gives us a better understanding of how these translate together. The complexity of this actually does compound at the global level, but that's a longer conversation, unfortunately. Very quickly, finally. For the Australian case study, as I alluded to, it was not a complete process, and there was still work to do, and there's always learning to be done here. But it did actually improve. We did learn quite a lot from that process, and it did have quite a lot of utility. And we do believe it is important to try and achieve something like this at the global level, but it has to be done properly and has to be calibrated in terms of what its limitations are. So thank you very much.
Thank you to the organizers and International Women's Day greetings to all of you. Any conversations on science and technologies or innovation should not become a prerogative of scientists to go ahead without any larger public debate, as they raise innumerable scientific, ethical, and regulatory dilemmas. My talk today will be informed by the following questions. Who is the public or publics that we hope to engage with? Who are the publics who are generally investing, creating knowledge, and its distribution, as well as setting the agenda for the engagement? What is the research of the knowledge being produced, and who consumes it for what purpose? And what are some of the challenges in engaging the publics? And it is with these larger questions in mind that I will begin with who the public is. Do we mean a group of people, populations, or individuals? Is this public homogeneous? Through my work in India, I'm aware that the category of the public is crisscrossed by differences of identities like race, caste, class, religion, gender identity, ability, ethnicity, refugee, and migratory status. These considerations, which are unfortunately ignored in the processes of the development innovations, take the center stage when we examine the implications of these technologies. And it is here where the various marginalizations come within the domain of technological advancement, as marginalized communities are largely at the fringes of the public that we are talking about. On the one end of the spectrum, we have stories of genome editing, such as CRISPR showing promising results for the treatment of SCD. And on the other end, we have the story of a 5-year-old child, Suraj, from a tribal community from a poor family in a rural district in Indian state, had to travel 250 kilometers from his village to undergo HP electrophoresis to confirm or rule out SCD at an institute. So I refer to this story to point out the fact that tribal people such as Suraj have to travel long distances to access basic diagnostic tests. So with an inadequate healthcare system, the treatment trajectories, and catastrophic out-of-pocket expenditure, to list only a few. Then the question that becomes even more pertinent is that our discussions on public engagement in human genome editing, have we been able to create the space?
Remain calm. Maybe they cut it short for us. Carry on, sorry.
Yes, sir. Thanks. I hope I will get that half a minute, because 5 minutes is too short, in fact. Yeah, so what I'm saying is, then the question that becomes even more pertinent is that in our discussions on public engagement in human genome editing, have we been able to create the spaces for such lived experiences? If not, why? And if yes, how? That is what I'm asking. We have a diverse population with many different cultures, religions, and languages, and any public engagement should take into account these differences. It will have to be located within economic, political, cultural, and country contexts in which genome editing is being discussed, lest they lose the necessary relevance to the very public. We have a history of caste-based discrimination, like the race. And there are concerns that genome editing could be misused to further marginalize certain communities, which I have seen in my own work on surrogacy and ARTs in India. How do...
I don't know how this is going to go, so you might as well just talk.
Shall I go on?
Make your bed as an endorsement.
Thank you. Thanks.
If you don't mind, just try and...
Shall I start again? Okay.
Carry on, yeah.
Okay, I think my flow is somewhere. So how do we ensure, in this context, non-discrimination, human rights? So then how do we engage with this public regarding, for example, the potential misuse of CRISPR, like preferences for heritable traits like fair skin, upper caste oocytes, demand for sun preference? Have seen in my own work in surrogacy and ARTs fail to problematize the social construction of concepts such as disability, disease, and normalcy. Further, in the climate of state restructuring and privatization, its priorities in relation to health have shifted from protecting the public good to promoting the interest of the corporate industry and pharma. So therefore, it is essential that while we are talking about public engagement, we engage in the question of power that operates in these discourses and engagements. In India, the debate and discussions are still ongoing, and the legal and regulatory framework is still being defined, and there remains uncertainty about the regulatory capacity to enforce ethical standards for GE and CRISPR. Yes, public engagement should be built upon principles including safety, efficacy, access and distribution, transparency, accountability, social justice, equity, rights, and eugenics. We spoke about that yesterday. What are some of the challenges in engaging the public? Challenges obviously lie around how we go about closing the gap or deficits in knowledge, because our purpose is not to build public acceptance. Rather, a continuous commitment is essential to truly create an equal public engagement where all the publics are at par on the basics and hence able to bring forth their arguments from an informed position. One of the ways I have always believed to increase public engagement is by allowing local level participation, a bottom-up approach where the perspectives and learnings from the ground feed into our innovations and policy making. I propose continuing public deliberation and debate within a wider spectrum among people with vast differences in knowledge, expertise, communications, and power as well. As quoted in a paper, science is a way of giving agency to people and not benefits. We don't want to be made beneficiaries. We want to be agents of change with equal autonomy and participation. Thank you very much.
So first of all, thank you for your indulgence, Shahrajini. It's unfortunate that your comments were punctuated by that. Please, I invite people to come to the microphone if there are questions. If not, in the meantime, there are a couple of questions that have come in through the Slido. But one of the first things I'd like to ask people to just comment on as a group in turn is, if you had to say, what was the one thing that's a big challenge in terms of global conversation, and it's not the fire alarm, it'll be something else, how is it that you would frame right now, based on how you're understanding what your contribution to the dialogue should be? What's the biggest challenge?
If I may start, thank you, Francoise. The biggest challenge to me and to reach, I would say, is to reaching out to those that we are not normally, they are not attending our meetings. Because at the end of the day, we're talking to believers. We're talking to those people that are already part of the conversation. And we want to reach out those people that have their own views, they have their doubts, and they have probably they're opposing some of the applications that we're discussing about. This is the most difficult part to me.
To me, the most, I mean, in a way, this thing is metaphorically right, because the fire alarm thinks that we should behave in accordance with its setting of the agenda. And, you know, to some degree, that is what the scientific community understandably believes, but it is not necessarily where the global agenda and where people's interests come from. I think there's a kind of hubris in assuming that you have to engage the public in whatever the
Sheila, you really set it off.
Well, I mean, I do think there's something that we should reflect on about this? I mean, why are we subjected to the machine? Why is it hitting this session and not some other session? And what does it mean to have the attention of this entire august company, all of us, be subjected to a mechanical intervention, right? So I think that the challenge in a way is to be symmetrical about the places that people are actually coming from, such as the 250 miles or whatever, or the distances traveled. And, you know, let me just say that even disability does not mean the same thing to everybody. I mean, as you were talking in particular, Simon, I was thinking that, you know, blindness in the world gave us a sonnet written in this country that produced lines that echo through the years. They also serve who only stand and wait. How do we think about disability? I mean, that is something that we need to think about before we go about curing it, in a sense. So are we getting the questions right? To me, that's the problem. And is the fire alarm science misdirecting our attention to thinking that its urgency should be our urgency?
I'm starting to get a bit of fear of missing out in terms of the fire alarm. Look, I mean, apart from endorsing what's already been said, I mean, I think it sort of feeds into what I would identify. I mean, there's so many challenges associated with this. The best way I can express overall one of the features of this particular topic is the inherent complexity, and I don't mean that in a sort of necessarily technical sense. I mean, I've been involved in engagement on climate change and so on, and you don't need to understand atmospheric physics to have a good conversation about issues like this in terms of, you know, what the community aspirations are and so on, and actually, you know, resolve the issues. This question in particular raises really profound, you know, sort of issues in terms of, you know, what it means to be human, etc., and actually sort of generating and engaging that. And then the Australian citizens jury is a good example of that. I mean, most citizens. Okay, I can relax now. You know, most members of the public don't come with a sort of prior form view that you can work with in that sense. You know, so constructing that and working with that and going across all the various elements in terms of what is important and identifying that is a really, really big challenge here. And my own personal anxiety is whether you can actually do this in a discrete event. No, of course the answer is you can't, but can you do it justice in that sense and design for it? And that is a really big challenge.
Yeah, I think there are many, but I just want to flag one is the kind of asymmetries which exist between the countries within the global north and south. I think that is something which we need to acknowledge. And also the advancement in technologies, you know, which are ethical and safe and effective, will they reach out to the, you know, poor where there is equity is a huge issue. And then the financial resources, whether, you know, these countries have that kind of financial resources and also the human capabilities to engage. I think that is something which we need to also understand. And the last point which I would like to say here is like what we have seen with COVID, you know, which is a recent experience when we talk about technology and how do we communicate the technological, you know, or even, you know, talking about the simple test or about the vaccines to the common people, what kind of language we are using. I think the communications is also an important aspect where, you know, it's very far for a person in a rural community having a smartphone and then accessing on the internet. So these are some of the realities which we need to also keep in mind. That is something which I would like to flag.
Thank you. In light of the disruptions we've had, we're going to bleed a tiny bit into the coffee break, and I ask your indulgence for that. What I'll do just in terms of managing time is we will take the 3 questions that are in the audience, and I will take 2 questions from Slido. I will ask everybody to be succinct with their questions and also with their answers. So first, please.
I'd like to ask the advice of the speakers. So there have been many exercises recently that try to look at what people think and know about human genome editing. One such exercise was led by Anna behind me recently, and the charity where I work did an exercise with Ipsos, the polling company, last year. Long story short, we found that more than half of the UK public supported, in principle, certain disease-avoiding clinical uses of germline genome editing. Fine, happy to talk to people afterwards about the methodology, etc. Now, we also found significant support for the use of human embryos in research, but that level of support was actually slightly less, even though it was significant. So what I'd like advice on is how to get across to people or explain to them or help people appreciate that research using human embryos proper, not just stem cell-based embryo models, but human embryos proper, was not only essential to the creation of IVF, it is absolutely essential if there is to be any use of germline genome editing in the clinic in future. How do we get that across?
Yeah, there's four microphones. Why don't we each take one? And I'll just say up front, for each question, not every person need think they should answer. I was distributing the microphone so that you can indicate that you're interested in responding.
Yes, definitely. I think what you're pointing is one of the challenges we have. And basically what we have to provide, as I said, is rigorous, reliable, and understandable information. And treating the public and treating the charities and treating the patient, you're talking to people as clever as you are. So this is fundamental to my understanding.
So I don't think that it should be treated as how do you get this across to people, because I think the opposition, I mean, I come from America and there is a very sharp polarization around that particular issue. It's not that the people on the opposing side do not understand how the technology works. It is that they have a very different notion of when life begins and what respect is due when. So, of course, people can change their minds. So we have seen a process of secularization over centuries now that ends up holding different views about the relationship between the biological and the spiritual. But to think that one is going to take one combination of biological and spiritual standpoints and override it with a different conception of biological and spiritual standpoints is not simply a matter of getting facts across. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of slow persuasion.
Yes, I'm not sure it is working. Agree, it's not a matter of information. I mean, if anything from our own research and experience indicates that there's information everywhere and there's misinformation everywhere. I mean, how do you compete with that in this context? What the other part of this element is actually the context itself in terms of the dispositions and the willingness to engage with information, who to trust in terms of information. This is an issue that goes well beyond genome editing, but sort of genuine attempts to engage in good spirit is really important in this sense, and that's not something that's going to develop overnight. But it is really important to engage, with an ethos of open honesty and not flinch from the complexities as well. But also, be very skeptical about what that means when you run a survey on an issue like this. Engage in a bit of epistemic humility, and that applies to me as much as anyone in terms of how we interpret this.
Thank you.
So I'm going to take the next question from Slido, and I'm just going to read it so I don't misinterpret it. It's from Bob Phelps. Can the general public be confident that citizens' juries are organized so jurors are fully and fairly informed? Expert panels and their advice is balanced, deliberations are democratic, and reports and recommendations reflect the diversity of informed conclusions that all participants reach. So I think, in a sense, calling into question that methodology. I think that's a question for you, Simon. It's a very good question, and unfortunately I have to confess that there is a lot of bad practice out there. It is a very unregulated environment in terms of professional, scholarly practice and norms. A colleague of mine, Nicole Curato, is doing work on a project she calls Deliberative Integrity, which addresses these questions. But there is a real challenge in this space, and it is very unfortunate, and that's incumbent upon us as a community to deal with that. So the only thing I can say personally about that is that, of course, it's a really good point, and we have to be, again, very sort of humble in our approach in terms of we just do not have the answer, and be open to criticisms as well. Sheila?
Well, I think that word humble, Simon, is really important, and I think maybe the answer is that one should keep in mind that a citizen's jury should be regarded as a technology of humility. It's not a matter of believing that the jury has found the facts because it's balanced, objective, and so on and so forth. It's that it's the best we can do, given that people are going to have different points of view, and we trust 12 pairs of eyes a bit more than we trust one pair of eyes. And if you think about the legal system where the jury is embedded, we rarely think of the jury as having ultimate say, at least in the American system. The judge decides something about the penalty. There are appeals. There are ways of getting a jury nullified if the jury has behaved in an odd way. And in any case, even the punishment meted out, if it's not capital, is something that can be overridden at various points. So if one keeps in mind that a jury is only a punctual approximation to something that just moves the compass needle a little bit, then maybe we don't put quite so much stake on whether it is correct in every particular. It's just a way station. It's something that gives us the next direction signal, but doesn't actually lead us to the destination.
Okay, so I'm just going to add then the follow-up question. This is the second question from Slido, so unfortunately it's going to be the last one from Slido, but I think it goes beyond just the juror's question. It does ask the question, who decides what constitutes full and fair information? And I think that could apply to the citizens jury, but it can apply to any of the initiatives that you've all spoken to. So I want to actually just ask max 2 out of the 4, and maybe the 2 who haven't spoken, to respond to that question. What do you imagine constitutes full and fair information, so that it's not just words?
Well, full and fair information is actually the way you are communicating. I have some like 20 years discussing and experience with patient groups. And what I've learned, it is a significant difference whether you're teaching or whether you are sharing your knowledge and your limitations. And this is essential to generate and to gain trust.
Sarojini, did you want to comment?
It's an important question. I think it's coming from various sources, like, in which domain we are operating from. Is it from the academia? Is it from the scientists? Is it from the policy makers? Or from the, the judiciary? So sometimes, we do have certain court orders which are talking about how to translate this information, for example, in the context of informed consent process. What do we mean by fair? What do we mean by, complete? This is something which is coming up, but I think it depends on the context and depends on the background. So it is up to, unless we, build the capacities of the communities, whether they can understand, whatever we are talking about fair information. There is no point if they don't understand what is in that format or package insert or the form or anything. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. I had said that we would take only 2 more questions, so depending on the time, I'll take the third, but I'm just saying that so that people don't rush to the microphone, because we are limited for time. So we'll, the next question, again, if you can be succinct, and we'll maybe get a couple of answers, but succinct. Thanks.
Hi, it's Anna Middleton. I'm a genetic counsellor psychologist, and I do public engagement in Cambridge. So my question is really about the funding landscape. So a few of you on the panel mentioned that it's difficult to get funding, or you're needing funding. There's some really, really big players in the room here in terms of funding bodies with a lot of leverage, and including the organising committee for this conference. And I just wanted to sort of put a plea out for the statement that'll be coming out later, to recognise that to do really good societal engagement, it has to be resourced properly, and we need a consistent evidence-based approach coordinated across the world. And I just wanted to put to the panel, have you got any ideas about how we get that funding to do that piece?
Well, it is clear. I couldn't agree more. I mean, it is clear that you need these resources in order to do this properly, and I would say professionally, and using the means and using the channels and using the social networks and everything that these days is required to be used in order to reach out everyone in the society. And this is, I guess, what we're all trying to do.
Your question gives me a chance to thank the principal funder of the Global Observatory, which is the John Templeton Foundation. But it's an enormous challenge if you understand that there's funding much more easily available for solutionistic enterprises, things that are going to lead to an answer that's immediately actionable in people's minds. But if you deeply believe, as we do in the observatory, that the point is clarification and not actionable results, there aren't many funders that are patient enough to accept the slowness of the ways in which culture works and in which human values change or don't change. So how can you have more funders who do not believe that the be-all and end-all is having the right solution on Monday morning, as my colleagues in the policy school like to say, but that it is about human enlightenment? How long did the first enlightenment take? And we're at the outset of the second.
Yeah, and it's a very good question. So the Global Citizens Assembly, as it stands, is not properly funded, adequately funded to do it properly, to do it justice. I'd like to thank John Templeton for wanting to fund us. Unfortunately, we were subject to reviewers who did not share our views on the need to adopt this as a sort of a slower process in terms of a more communicative approach rather than sort of a definitive outcome, and that include the representation. And unfortunately, we had a bit of a breakdown in sort of procedure in that sense. And this reflects a sort of wider challenge, which has already been spoken about, and it's something that needs to be systematically addressed.
We'll take the next question, and I'm sorry to say it will be the last question, but if you come up for the next talk, next session, I'll let you speak then. Thanks, sorry. But we do need to move things along. So this will be the last question for this before we move on to the next session.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. I think there are a lot of questions that have come up about sort of the information that's provided in these sorts of public engagement exercises. And I think part of that is because they're so often conceived as being sort of a separate exercise that's pulled out of broader conversations about politics and society and what it means to be human that we might be having, and focuses them so narrowly on this question of what do we do about heritable genome editing and sort of trying to come to an answer. So my question is how you can make space for broader questions coming from different perspectives, more political perspectives, disability rights groups, reproductive rights and justice, other justice-oriented movements have strong feelings about this issue, and the information that's relevant to that lens on the discussions is often not considered as part of what should be presented to people when they're discussing this. But also, how can we make space for questions that don't sound like the right questions to be having about heritable genome editing? We've even seen examples of that here in the summit, where questions that are asked in a language that seems unfamiliar or out of line with how maybe the scientists would define the issue are even sort of laughed at from the stage. So how can we make space for questions that people have when they're not in the language that's been determined to sort of govern this question?
If I could take just a very quick crack at that. I just want to say that regulation was presented yesterday as a bottleneck, and that's partly because the product doesn't get to the market or into the bodies as quickly as it might otherwise. But all of our societies represented in this room have some experience with governmental intervention into the development of new technologies. And I think one of the major things to say positively about those processes is that they deal with exactly the kind of question you're raising. Because if they're pulling together, as in the American formulation, it goes, the interested and affected parties, it means some people will come forward who are not talking the right language, and yet the governmental agency that's responsible has a responsibility to respond, and so there is a kind of accountability. So I think one has to put on the table that the interests of speed are not always the interests of deliberation.
Very quickly, information, ideally, this is a recursive process in the sense that what is relevant information actually something that evolves. In the Global Citizens Assembly idea, there's sort of a complexity in the information that goes in the process. There's a working through that, but there's also an as well, and that generates more questions and more information, and actually that we need, but also is a sort of source of information itself. But ideally, it creates a space where there is scope for as wide as possible input, and that requires some creative thinking in terms of how to do that. Possibly even a parallel online process, feeding in, so networking them together, and so on. It is a really important challenge.
Yeah, we're trying to get the voice and to let everyone ask whatever questions. So there are no silly questions. There are not questions that shouldn't be asked. It's always a matter of how you deal with this and how you reach out the type of languages that you need to use to communicate with that particular person. And this is where I think we have to put our efforts. I mean, if we are not able to reach out to that person, we are not doing our job.
Yeah, I completely endorse what you said. That's what we are trying in our own country. Like, it's as scientists, as researchers, as public health advocates, and also working with the communities, try to bring together and have these deliberations, whether it is from disability rights or reproductive justice activists. Like, everybody should be on, talking at the same table, and then those missing voices from the community should also be part of that dialogue. Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
And
So I'm going to
Francoise, if you just just a small thing. Yesterday, the patient group said that they saw a decline in the discussions of these issues in the patient groups, and I was thinking that perhaps we need to reflect on how we have been handling the expectations, and how we have to do better trying to convey these expectations in an honest way and try to be fair on what is possible and what is not yet possible, just to be fair and be correct on this.
Great. Well, I'm just going to thank the panelists, and all of you are welcome to come back to them with questions later on. Thank you.
I just want to apologize yet again about the fire alarm. Of course, it wasn't deliberate. We didn't know it was going to happen, definitely, until Friday. And we asked if it could not happen, and we were told it has to happen. We have a building full of over 1,500 people. The fire alarms have to be tested every week. It's just unfortunate it was in this session. That wasn't deliberate at all. And the reason for testing the fire alarms is to make sure there's no problem with the system, which there was, which is why it went on far too long. So it's just demonstrating that it needed to be tested. Apologies for this. It's been fixed now, so it shouldn't happen again. No other sessions should be affected, but I'm just really sorry that this one was.
Great. Well, it falls to me to start the next session that's part of this. Here we're going to, I think, address a topic that's been of great concern to a number of people, because the questions have come up in the previous 2 days, but we do actually have a session where those questions, I think, are germane. And so the session now is on the question, are there compelling reasons for heritable human genome editing? And you'll appreciate there's a broad spectrum of perspectives. We're not going to hear all the possible perspectives. We will hear two. These are our panelists, and they will be presenting in that order. I will not, again, take any of the time to go over their biographies, because we obviously have substantive discussions we want to have. I do want to say that, most unfortunately, Cesar is unable to join us in person. That was late breaking news, and so he will be joining us online so that we're able to still get a couple of perspectives on this important issue. And with that, I invite our first speaker, Efrat, to join us.
So good morning. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this thought-provoking meeting. I noticed that in many of the previous talks, the speakers really took care to emphasize that they were only discussing, somatic gene editing. Nobody really wanted to touch heritable with a 10-foot pole, but I'm not going to have this luxury. So I'm going to give a very brief interview of the global regulation, some specifics of the Israeli law, and then speak about what might be compelling reasons for heritable genome editing based on the values of societies that place a premium on the ability to create a family by bearing children, what I've called here natalist societies. 2 days ago, we were really treated to, I think, an incredibly powerful and moving session about sickle cell disease. And I don't know how many of you remember this, but in the panel, after the talks, someone asked Dr. Alexis Thompson what led parents to refuse gene therapy for their affected children. And she said that she learned that future infertility, which is a side effect of the chemotherapy associated with the gene therapy process, was a major reason for refusing gene therapy for children. And it's so much so that she now indicates this to parents at the very beginning of discussions on gene therapy, and that this is a hard no for many parents. So I want you to hold on to that thought. So what is the current regulatory landscape of heritable genome editing? I thank our moderator, Françoise, for use of these slides from her very comprehensive survey on international policies. Now, when you look at this map, it looks as though the landscape is entirely clear. Heritable human genome editing is currently forbidden by law in almost all countries, and in over 100 countries surveyed, there's not a single country where heritable genome editing is currently permitted. Now, this is really an interesting and stark contrast to the regulations on germline genome editing for research or non-reproductive purposes. You see a lot more colors in this map. And really what we see is that there is a prohibition in about half of countries with specific legislation, and it's permitted in about 1/4 of countries that have specific legislation on germline genome editing for research. I think this difference is because research use is already feasible. So countries have already had to grapple with their position on this topic. And when they did that, they did not come all to the same uniform conclusion. In fact, when you look at the uniformity of the prohibition, it has led some to conclude that we will be able to reach at some point an international or global consensus on what can be done. But is this true? I suspect that this university is not really fundamental, but it's pragmatic, and it's really based mostly on safety concerns. In particular, the realization that there are still major issues with safety, and clinical application would not take place until these issues are resolved. So, however, I do think this is an opportunity. We have to use this space in the time-science continuum to perform the thought experiment. What would happen if safety were achieved? I realize this is a big if, but we need to start thinking about it. And I suspect that if this happens, if safety is really possible, we're going to see a much greater variability that will emerge between countries. And that even while we adhere to frameworks of accepted ethical principles, the socio-cultural context of countries is going to have a major effect, because as noted many times in this conference, these are going to be value-based judgments. And some core values are universal, obviously, but their relative weight could also be different in different societies. In this context, I want to mention the Israeli law, because Israeli ethicists and legislators realized early on that prohibition may not necessarily remain absolute. In Israel, we have the so-called cloning law. The formal name is the Law Forbidding Genetic Intervention. It was legislated in 1999 amidst the fear of imminent human cloning after the first report of Dolly the sheep. This law completely prohibits reproductive genetic manipulation, but it also indicates that these restrictions have to be continuously re-examined, taking into consideration the freedom of scientific research and for the purpose of advancing medicine. The law has two flexibility mechanisms, and this was influenced by the Ethics Committee of the Israeli Academy of Sciences. At the time, there was political pressure to respond rapidly to the development of mammalian cloning, but many members of the committee were concerned that a rigid law would hamper both research and future clinical application in a field that is very fast-moving. The solution was to build in flexibility. First, the law is self-expiring. It needs to be re-ratified every 5 years, and it's the only Israeli law that has such a mechanism. And in addition to the automatic expiration, there's also another escape mechanism in that the National Ethics Committee and the Ministry of Health can enable new interventions if they occur within these 5-year periods. So these are locally important because until recently in our tragic situation, it normally is difficult to change laws in Israel, but they also reflect the viewpoint. There may come a day where heritable human genome editing may be performed. If we go back to the global view, obviously other countries could adapt or change their laws on heritable genomic editing, and this could well result, as I said, in greater variability rather than uniformity. So let's go back to the thought experiment. What would be a compelling reason to perform heritable gene editing? And I would argue that a major impetus would be applications that overcome infertility or enable biological parenthood. And these are the same motivations that have driven assisted reproductive technologies in general. I want to make a comment about biological parenthood and stress that I do not believe, nor do I want to imply, that biological parenthood is preferable to other forms of parenthood, such as adoption or gamete donation. But for many people worldwide, biological parenthood is a major life goal, and we cannot ignore that. If we look at gene editing to treat infertility, we can think about editing gametes with deficient function, like implantation defects or embryonically lethal conditions. If we think about enabling biological parenthood, there's been a lot of focus on very rare genetic scenarios where no healthy child is possible. For example, let's say two partners have sickle cell disease, or a parent who is homozygous for a dominant disease. But these are very rare and extreme situations. I would argue that the much more common situation is going to be in pregestational testing. My clinical lab has a very large molecular pregestational testing service, and I can tell you there are many situations where we have very few available embryos, either for various reasons, both related to fertility and to the disease for which we are doing the PGT. In this kind of situation, is it reasonable, or would we want to subject the woman to multiple cycles of IVF? Would that be preferable to editing if editing were safe? And as an aside, I would say, even ethically, is discarding affected embryos preferable to editing if that can be performed safely? But in any case, if we look at it from this point of view, we're really shifting the emphasis of the debate from the embryo to the prospective parents. I'm no philosopher, I'm a physician. But I want to say that when we're dealing with the parents already exists and they have rights and they have wishes. This is as opposed to the embryo, which does not exist. So if we shift it to the parents, the prospective parents, they have rights such as the right to health and the right to autonomy. And from an ethics point of view, if parenthood is a human right, then we should endeavor to help achieve it. And if infertility is a disease, then we should endeavor to treat it, so long, obviously, as this is done ethically. So, these are topics that could furnish a discussion for multiple sessions. I'm just going to touch on them very briefly. But, is parenthood a human right? If we look at Article 16 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it states that men and women of full age have the right to marry and to found a family. Article 12 of the European Convention on Human Rights echoes the same language, the right to marry and to found a family, although I will note that the Commission has held that it could not be interpreted to mean that a person must at all times be given the actual possibility to procreate, and this has to do with resources for funding infertility treatments. So is infertility a disease? That's another fraught question. But just to frame it pragmatically, most societies regard infertility as a medical condition which is treated by physicians, and furthermore, many countries with public health systems pay for fertility treatments. This is a map of the general fertility treatment landscape in Europe. The greener the better, the redder the worse. And in general, green countries, and even some yellow countries, provide at least partial public funding for IVF. Looking globally, we can see that the use of IVF continues to increase dramatically, and there's been a 20% increase in cycles just between 2014 and 2017, which is the last date for which data are available. More than that, we can see that the use of IVF has been expanding all over the world, including in countries that are middle to low income, reflecting the importance of this technology. So where does this leave us? I would like to remind us of the guiding principles for all uses of genome editing, which were outlined in the report of the American National Academy of Sciences, a committee in which I was honored to be a member. If we look at the uses for treating infertility and enabling parenthood, I would argue that if heritable editing becomes safe, such uses could certainly fall under the promotion of well-being, and offering this option would fulfill the autonomy of prospective parents if they wish to do so. If this can be carried out while fulfilling all other guiding principles, and I'm not ignoring issues of equity and access which have been widely discussed at this meeting, then I believe that the social context where having a biological family is still an imperative, in those situations and cultures, this could become a compelling reason for heritable genome gene editing. And I'd like to thank you for your attention.
So we have Cesar speaking next, who's joining us online. So if we could switch to the Zoom so he can present, that'd be great. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Oh, brilliant. So I think I'll just get going, and then I'll stop after like 10 minutes. So thank you very much to the organizers of the summit, and also thank you very much to Francois for actually putting together this panel. And as she said at the beginning, here I'm actually wondering if there are compelling reasons for heritable human genome editing. And the aim of like this very brief talk is actually defend that some heritable human genome editing interventions can indeed be therapeutic in nature, and actually that it is not the case that all such interventions just create healthy human individuals. And then in order to do this, actually, it's important to stress that this point is about answering a question about the nature of heritable human genome editing interventions. And it's not a talk about, in practice, how often are heritable genome editing interventions therapeutic, or what type of moral reasons there are in favor of offering such interventions, if indeed they are therapeutic. So these are important questions, but are these current questions that actually I'm going to engage with. Now, the background to this talk is actually that Tina Rulli, that is going to speak after me, actually has written a fantastic paper where she has argued that reproductive uses of CRISPR, those are that actually have germinal implications, do not save lives, cure, or offer a unique opportunity for disease prevention. And I think that actually if she were right, then what is thought to be one of the strongest arguments for the development and implementation of heritable human genome editing interventions could actually fail. And it would do so because it is grounded on the assumption that actually these particular interventions can be therapeutic in nature. Now, Tina's strategy is quite straightforward. So she presents a definition of actually what cures or therapies are. Then she shows that heritable human genome editing interventions do not meet one of the necessary conditions stipulated in the definition. And then she uses this conclusion to further argue that actually the moral reasons that we have to develop and invest in such biotechnologies are weaker than first thought. Now, as a background, and everyone here knows that heritable human genome editing interventions are a subset of genome editing interventions, which actually are carried out in gametes, gamete progenitor cells, and early embryos. And then, of course, that these changes in the genome could be passed down to future generations. Now, the important thing here is that, of course, if we're actually going to discuss if they are therapeutic or not, we actually need a definition of treatment. And then Tina presents the following ones. She says that for an intervention to count as a treatment or cure, in addition to it being the case that A, if X is administered, it will help soothe, heal, or remedy someone's illness, it is also the case that if B, if X is not administered, a person will suffer more or die earlier than if it had been. And the important here, what you need to pay attention here is actually that condition B is a counterfactual condition. Now, but then when we think about, for example, using CRISPR in reproductive scenarios, one of the issues that we have to ponder is that what are the options available to couples that are at risk of transmitting genetic diseases and can resort, for example, to reproductive CRISPR, as Tina calls it. Now, there are three options according to her. So we could create a child in a genetically modified and healthy state using CRISPR. So we could create a child with a substantial risk of genetic disease, not using CRISPR, or we do not create a child at all. And now, interestingly, there's an asymmetry here between the number of available courses of action between prospective parents and people suffering from non-reproductive conditions. And this is because in non-reproductive conditions, for example, when people are thinking about somatic genome therapy, an individual could actually partake in a therapy, or actually they could refrain from partaking in the therapy. So there's like two options rather than three. And in the cases of heritable human genome editing interventions are different. At least that's what Tina has argued for. Because refraining for the first option, that means not creating a child in a genetically modified and healthy state, does not default in the second option. This is creating a child with a substantial risk of some genetic disease. And according to her, like prospective parents in reproductive genome editing scenarios actually can choose between 2 and 3. This is between creating a child with a substantial risk of some genetic disease, not using CRISPR, or actually do not create a child at all. And it's actually the existence of this possibility between choosing 2 or 3 that makes Tina conclude that the reproductive genome editing interventions actually do not satisfy the counterfactual condition of her of the definition of therapy that she presents. And if you remember, the counterfactual condition is that if X is not administered, a person will suffer more or die earlier than if it had been. Now, that reproductive genome editing interventions do not satisfy this counterfactual condition makes actually Tina conclude that they are not therapeutic. And she says, in the R-CRISPR case, the existence of a child with or without the disease is not inevitable. Her existence is still a matter of a distinct and separate choice. But I think that there's and this is my point of contention with her, that actually we need to pay attention to the difference between the actual editing process and the clinical decision to employ a genome editing technology. And actually, when we pay attention to these 2 scenarios, actually we can say that some interventions are indeed therapeutic. Now, the clinical decision to employ reproductive CRISPR, for example, can occur prior to the creation of the embryo, which actually will be subject to such an intervention. So imagine a couple where one of the prospective parents has known since childhood that he's homozygous for a dominant genetic disease of late onset, and the couple decides to actually go to a fertility specialist. Now, the fertility specialist tells them that they can choose to undergo IVF plus genome editing to correct the deleterious genetic mutation in all embryos. Now, if the couple actually decides to follow this path, then what happens is that this particular decision affects which embryos will be created and actually which embryos will be brought into existence. But on the other hand, we actually have clinical decisions, and we can have clinical decisions to employ CRISPR or reproductive CRISPR that can be made after actually the creation of embryos has happened. And actually, a similar scenario to the one that I just presented comes to mind. So imagine a couple that undergoes IVF and creates some embryos which actually are cryopreserved. And then let's also suppose that a couple of months afterwards, the mother is informed that she is homozygous for a dominant monogenetic disease of late onset. And the fertility doctor tells them that actually they don't have to worry, since they can decide to employ CRISPR to correct the deleterious genetic mutations of their already stored embryos. And the important bit here is that actually this decision to employ genome editing is not among the causes of the decision to create the embryos in the first place. And I think that this actually latter case shows that Tina's third option, do not create an individual at all, is not open actually when deciding whether to carry out certain heritable human genome editing interventions. And it is relevant because, of course, she maintains that it is the existence of option 3 that grounds the fundamental difference between, for example, things like reproductive CRISPR and conventional treatments such as somatic intervention. Now, according to Tina, it's a metaphysical stretch to actually call a not yet created or implanted embryo patient. But I think there's a bunch of space for actually metaphysical discussion about actually whether this might be right, and actually this is necessary for something to be called therapeutic down the line. But even when actually there might be a space for philosophers to debate about the metaphysics of embryology, Tina accepts that those cases where genome editing is carried out on existing embryos might be problematic for her conclusion. And one of the objections that actually she tries to address is if, at least in some cases, reproductive CRISPR is actually therapeutic because it is employed directly on embryos. Now, when reproductive CRISPR is used directly on embryos with genetic defects, and it only affects their qualitative identity, because it might be the case that the intervention is of such a large extent that it would affect what philosophers call numerical identity. So it will be a different thing. Then actually I think it could be a therapy. And then one example of it might be Huntington's. And Tina goes forward to argue that there is a significant difference between a case like Huntington's and what she considers to be standard therapeutic interventions. And this difference, according to her, is that we only create an embryo with defects in the first place, actually so that we can go then and manipulate it using CRISPR. And she moves on to suggest that even if the actual editing process is therapeutic, its moral value is suspect, since the doctor's actions in its totality, yet like the clinical decision to employ, could hardly be called curative, for he first created harm. So he first created this particular type of embryo. Now, if one insists in calling, and she says this, calling this a cure or a therapy, it is certain a non-standard usage of the concept. It's warrant a distinction from standard cures that save lives and prevent otherwise probable harms. But I think the reply to this particular reply is that reproductive genome editing interventions actually can happen on an implanted embryos whose creation antecedes any decision or thought about carrying out a genome editing intervention. And thus that actually we must conclude that heritable human genome editing intervention can be therapeutic in a standard way, as people regularly talk about what are therapeutic interventions. So my conclusion is that actually there might be some instances when heritable human genome editing interventions can be therapeutic in nature. But I think the most important thing here is just to stress that I think that this discussion is a live discussion, and actually I will recommend that all of you go and read Tina's paper because it's very good, and I think actually it opens for an interesting discussion on how we should conceive therapies and germline human genome editing. Yeah, thanks very much.
It was my understanding that we would not be engaging in a back and forth, but had I known that Cesar wanted to address my argument, I certainly would have prepared a response to his critique of my argument. But instead, I'm going to give you the talk I had prepared to begin with, and it'll help clarify some of the argument here. I'm happy to address Cesar's objections and critiques in the Q&A. And I've really expanded the argument beyond just the concern about whether semantically we want to call heritable human genome editing a therapy or not. The question really is, what is the value, whatever you do want to call it? And so that's what I'll be addressing today. So in a seminal gold standard paper in clinical research ethics, What Makes Clinical Research Ethical, bioethicists Emanuel, Wendler, and Grady provide a framework of 7 jointly necessary and sufficient conditions for ensuring that clinical research is ethical. They derive these conditions from familiar, long-standing ethics and regulatory documents, such as the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, and the international guidelines for biomedical research involving human subjects. For research to be ethical, it must meet all 7 conditions. The first among the 7 is the research must have social or scientific value. They write, to be ethical, clinical research must be valuable, meaning that it evaluates a diagnostic or therapeutic intervention that could lead to improvements in health or well-being. Examples of research that would not be socially or scientifically valuable include clinical research with non-generalizable results, a trifling hypothesis, or substantial or total overlap with proven results. They offer 2 fundamental reasons for the value condition. First, we are responsible for using finite resources wisely. So even if major funding agencies could fund all applications for clinical research, doing so would divert resources from other worthy social pursuits. Second is a concern about exploitation. Since all research is potentially harmful, we cannot ethically expose humans to those harms if there is no prospect of social or scientific benefit. They go on to say that it is possible to compare the relative value of different studies in terms of prospects for improvements in health or well-being, and that doing so is essential to determining funding priorities. And I would add that bringing a technology to aid human health to market requires clinical research. If the research cannot be ethical, then neither can the use of national public funds in bringing it to market. So the social value condition must also be met for national funding agencies. So as you've heard, I have argued previously that reproductive uses of CRISPR in human gametes and embryos does not, contrary to widespread claims on its behalf, save lives, cure disease, or have therapeutic value. My arguments generalize to heritable human genome editing technologies, which I'll refer to here as reproductive genome modification, because as you'll see, my primary concern has nothing to do with the heritability of the germline, or heritability or germline modifications, and I'm really focused on the use of the technology in creating new people, that is in reproduction. So many scientists and ethicists have made, and they continue to make, curative, therapeutic, or life-saving claims about the technology. They claim that reproductive genome modification would prevent disease in future generations, save lives, offer a cure or treatment for diseases that people would otherwise have, that it is uniquely valuable in doing so, given a lack of alternatives, and some conflate reproductive applications with somatic therapeutic ones. To the contrary, I argue that reproductive genome modification is not a cure or therapy. It will not save lives. It does not have unique value in preventing disease in future generations. So with an actual standard therapy or cure, when we deploy it, we make a person better off than she otherwise would have been. In fact, what we do is hopefully cure, alleviate, or lessen a bad disease state for them. So if we do not use a cure or therapy, someone is sicker than she otherwise could have been, or in the worst case, she might die. The possibility for someone to be in a harm disease state is what gives therapies their moral urgency and value. Somatic gene therapy is a standard cure in this way and has important therapeutic value. But reproductive genome modification does not alleviate or prevent a harmful disease state for someone. Rather, the technology is deployed in a procedure that results in the creation of a person free from some monogenic disease who need not exist at all. That is, if we do not use the technology, it's not the case that necessarily someone comes to exist and suffers from a disease. Their existence is not inevitable. Whereas with standard cures and therapies, if we do not use them, a sick person suffers. With reproductive genome modification, if we do not use it, we have to make a separate, distinct, and additional choice to create a person anyway who will suffer from the disease. And we could instead use an array of other options to create a child free of the disease and to help people become parents to a healthy child instead. So in other words, reproductive genome modification isn't treating a baby who is on their way into existence, so to speak, whose existence is otherwise inevitable. Rather, it's just part of a reproductive decision to create a baby free of some specific disease. That's different than curing a baby who would otherwise be sick from a disease. Since reproductive genome modification fails to alleviate an otherwise inevitable disease state, it fails to have the morally urgent basis and value of therapies. So whether you want to technically call it a therapy or not, it fails to have that moral urgency. Prospective parents who wish to create a child and want to use reproductive genome modification to edit out a potential disease have instead an array of other options. They can use gamete donation for the affected sperm or egg. They can adopt a child. Now, critics might say that these options are subpar because they do not preserve the genetic relation between the parents and the child, but this is an entirely different concern altogether. So now we've shifted the alleged value of reproductive genome modification. It is in preserving genetic relatedness between parent and child, not in curing and saving lives. But there already exists a well-proven intervention for those who are at risk of passing on serious monogenic disease to their children and who want to be genetically related to their child. It's pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, PGD, where we combine the parent's sperm and egg outside the body, create embryos, then diagnose the embryo for the disease in question, only implanting those embryos that are healthy. In fact, reproductive genome modification will usually require the use of PGD in the first place, since we need to diagnose which embryos need the gene modification. So reproductive genome modification is redundant to an existing technology on the market, but then it adds risks that PGD does not have in unintended edits or mosaicism. So PGD can do all that reproductive genome modification purports to do. In fact, if we want to reduce the incidence of monogenic disease, then what we need is routine testing for couples who don't know they are carriers rather than embryo or gamete editing. PGD, as well as gamete donation or adoption for carriers of monogenic disease, already allow us to prevent or reduce serious monogenic disorders in future generations. Reproductive genome modification does not uniquely do this. Genetic modification is only uniquely valuable when all the embryos of a couple would be affected by the genetic disorder. For example, when one or both parents are homozygous for a dominant disorder, or both parents are homozygous for a recessive disorder. This is exceedingly rare. We're talking dozens of individuals for Huntington's worldwide, for example. A coupling of two people homozygous with the same recessive disorder is put at 1 per 1 million cases. There are admittedly additional others for whom PGD is inefficient, although not strictly infeasible. But remember, all of these people have reproductive options available to them in gamete donation or adoption. In brief, reproductive genome modification's value is in helping people at risk of passing on serious monogenic disorders to have healthy, genetically related children. But this is redundant to long-established and safe interventions we already have. Investment in redundant technologies lacks social value, and lacking social value renders clinical research and funding of that technology unethical. The remaining and unique value of reproductive genome modification rests in the potential to help a small number of people for whom PGD is not an option, who'd prefer to be genetically related to their children rather than use donor gametes. This is a drastic drop in what is claimed to be the social value of this technology, curing disease and saving lives, to the real social value, meeting the non-medical preferences of a small number of people. Their interests matter, of course, and I am not denigrating them, but we have finite resources with many other, more serious claims to use them. We can instead invest the time, the talent, and resources in bringing to market interventions that help a much larger number of people, or meet serious medical and life-threatening needs, or both. We know that many such diseases, which disproportionately affect the global poor, are deeply underfunded. But one need not be a maximizer or a utilitarian to make the case here. The social value of reproductive genome modification simply falls far below a threshold of social value in a world with many unmet, life-threatening medical needs. While my focus today has been on the limited social value of reproductive genome modification compared to other interventions we can invest in, the low social value grounds another objection to the technology. There are a bevy of serious objections to reproductive genome modification. They include concerns about the safety of the technology in unintended modifications and genetic mosaicism, the risk of dangerous modifications let loose in the human gene pool, a slippery slope to using the technology to create designer babies, unethical eugenic uses of the technology that harm disability communities, and unequal, unfair access to the technology that only advantages the wealthy. So if these objections are weighty, then it would require making a strong case for the value and importance of reproductive genome modification to outweigh them. But as I've argued, reproductive genome modification has comparatively low value, so it cannot do this work. Thank you.
So I want to thank all three speakers for staying within the time limit. They each had 10 minutes. I'm going to ask Efrat to come and join us, and Cesar, I believe, is going to come online. Because I know that we're going into the coffee break, and I did say early on, yes, I did say early on we would go into the coffee break. I'm going to put my timer on, and the timer's going on for 15 minutes. At the end of that, if people are still, if there's no fire alarm, after that, or if we haven't gotten to Robin, who's at the end of the line there, I'll ask people's indulgence if they wish to continue, but otherwise, in order to keep us on time for the whole meeting, I'm going to put my timer on. You'll all hear it when it alarms. Oh, apparently we're allowed to drink. Okay, so how about, I'm going to make an executive decision. Robin's at the back. He can tell me if I can't do this. If people wish to leave now or in the next 15, 20 minutes, go get a coffee and bring it back in, we will have the coffee break here. How's that? I think it's an important topic, and I would hate to be the one that has to try to tell people they can't speak. Okay. I will then I will then just watch the clock. I won't need a timer. Okay. We are not having a quick break. People can choose to get up and go get a coffee and come back in. So if you're not interested in one of the questions or comments, go help yourself to coffee. I think that that's the only way that we can do this and do justice to the topic. So first of all, I want to thank all three speakers, and I also want to thank the audience for your indulgence. And we will start with the first question. And those of you who wish to add questions on Slido, I will try to intersperse them.
Thank you very much. I'm Pete Mills from the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. I noticed that the speakers didn't really say very much about the heritability of genomic modifications down the generations. I know Tina said she wasn't going to address that specifically, but I'd like to invite them to say a little bit more about the implications of making an alteration that can be inherited down the generations. Now, the reason I ask this, I'm inclined to agree with most of the speakers that actually the purpose of genome editing is not obviously therapeutic in a heritable way, or at least not in a simple sense. And indeed, I've argued, and Nuffield Council's argued, that what we should do instead of focusing on whether or not it's therapeutic is really to focus on whether or not there are good reasons to do this. And I wouldn't discount the possibility that reproductive reasons might fall into that class of good reasons, but I think that's a question that requires a much broader discussion.
Okay, Pete, can I cut you off there and ask them to engage, because we've just got
Can
so
I just
many
say
people.
one more thing? So why I think this heritability question is important is because if you want to frame heritable alteration within a kind of medical frame, then I don't think you can do it at an individual level, but you're compelled to do it at a population health level. And I think the implications of that need considering. Thank you.
So I did limit myself. I did limit myself to the reproductive, and I did that because I think a lot of the debate is centered on this designer baby issue, which is very far off, and in fact, partly can be done today by using PGT. You don't need genome editing for that. So I would say simplistically, for medical purposes, you would be reverting to the wild type sequence or to the so-called normal sequence, and in that sense, I don't think there's a danger of unleashing. Again, assuming we don't have off-target effects, I don't think there's a danger of unleashing mutations into the human gene pool. I agree that that heritable changes that are novel are going to be a different story, but I also think that they're even further off, because even if you think about enhancement, which I'm not a proponent of, but again, that thought experiment, the way probably that enhancement will be done would be to look at the population, look at people who have enhanced capabilities, whatever those might be, see what their genetic variation is. So again, you're going to be using variations that already exist in the population that you already have information on. In fact, that's what we heard yesterday. I'm sorry, I don't remember the physician's name, but with PSK-C9, it's essentially that thing, right? I mean, the enhancement is basically doing loss of function mutations that have already been found in the human gene pool, creating them, and that way getting a therapeutic advantage. So I think if you think about either reverting to the normal sequence or introducing variants that already exist in the population, that's already enough enough action before you ever get to totally novel changes.
Cesar, did you want to come in and comment?
I think, yeah, no.
No, okay. Tina, did you want to add something or not?
I'll just say I've only addressed it indirectly in my talk and in my work, and it's just, you have this list of concerns, including the heritability concern that you could get a deleterious mutation, that would go on into the human gene pool, and it's some risk, and so the question is, what could counterbalance that risk? So I do think the talk of social value is deeply relevant to that question, because the social value is so low, it doesn't seem worth the risk. And so that's how I look at that issue.
I work with neuromuscular disorders, and I've been faced more than often with women that are carrier of Duchenne mutations and want to have healthy children. And I want just to tell you a short story that I faced recently, a lady who wanted to have pre-implantation diagnosis, and all her embryos had either mutations of the Duchenne gene or had translocations, could not be implanted. And she tried twice the cycle and didn't work, and so they decided to have natural children, and she had a boy affected with Duchenne dystrophy, and then in the second time she had a girl who was a carrier. So this girl will transmit to the next generation. So I absolutely support effort when she says that better to discard than to edit. I think that you can have this situation more often than you think.
Any comments or no?
No, I just think that's the point I was trying to make, that really what, I think if this happens, it'll be much more in the realm of PGT than those very rare situations of, homozygote recessive matings and and people who are homozygous for dominant diseases. I think that's going to be the common scenario.
I think I would just want to add, first of all, I appreciate that story. I know there's a lot of pain in those stories, and it's hard to be the one up here saying, okay, I hear that, but we shouldn't employ it. We shouldn't develop a technology that could help people like that. But what I want to say is there are stories of people across this globe with serious medical needs. And it's easy when you're a conference like this to only think of the ones that are salient, only the ones we're talking about now. But you could bring here anybody who's part of an underserved disease population where we could be diverting resources and time and energy towards addressing their needs and also give compelling stories. And so part of what we have to do as ethicists and public policymakers is step back and take a larger broad scope view of which sorts of diseases and conditions we put our energy and resources towards. And that's why I'm pushing for saying, we need to look at addressing needs that affect a large number of people and or are life-threatening, because we have a lot of those which are underfunded as well.
So I have a question.
We should have a conference on communicable diseases instead of
Okay, I have a question from the Slido, from Kiran Musunuru, whom we heard from yesterday. And the question is, isn't the argument for social value for reproductive genome modification for a small number of couples, Huntington's, sickle cell disease, etc., made even weaker when one can use donor gametes from a healthy relative, for example, a sibling, and still maintain genetic relatedness?
So I will say that, I'll just reiterate, I don't think it's those very rare cases that are the social value. And I think, somebody spoke yesterday about the world having all the same set of core values. Where I come from, which is the Middle East, there is a huge value placed on parent-child genetic relatedness. And in fact, use of gametes is pretty much prohibited in Islam, which is a major religion in our area. So, I think those are, like I said, I think it's important to realize that we're not, it's very important for me personally to say that, biological parenthood is not preferable, but I think we can't ignore the fact that for, large swaths of the human population globally, this is what they aspire to. And I think, just to answer Tina also, if the case were also where is our money better allocated, then probably maybe all of infertility treatment doesn't make a lot of sense, right? We're better treating existent people than future people. But as a society, we haven't made that call. So, and I think the use of assisted reproduction technology just exemplifies this.
Okay, one more question from Slido, and I'll go back to the room, from Andy Greenfield. PGD is a non-therapeutic germline intervention. So is it not odd to base an argument against a non-therapeutic germline intervention, heritable human genome editing, on the availability of its alternative, which also falls in that category?
Yeah, so this is directly related to the sort of semantic quibble Cesar and I are having about whether something's a therapy or not, when the real question is whether it's socially valuable or not. So PGD is a reproductive selective technology that's technically not a therapy, but as social value for those who want to have genetically related children. If you want to push me on it, personally, I don't think it's more valuable than gamete donation, and it's definitely not more than adoption. So I'm happy to take on that criticism.
Cesar, did you wish to comment?
So I think I could say something about the social value, and then, so maybe because it relates to the question and actually what Tina just said. And I think sometimes it seems that there has been not a lot of attention paid to how other investments in technologies and new therapeutics actually are assessed against the other reproductive technologies. And what I'm trying to say there is that people actually pay a lot of attention to how much money is invested in reproductive technologies or what could be considered reproductive technologies. But this all other area of biological research actually gets overlooked. And then no one says actually what the first thing that we need to say is actually see how much money we're investing across the board in these different diseases and say, okay, what would be the social value of actually those different interventions? Because of course, it might be the case that, benefiting couples who might not be able to actually have genetically related children is not on par with, for example, saving existing people who might have cancer or other terrible diseases. But the fact is that it might be above other types of investment that is being done now in the biotech sector. So the fact is that sometimes people compare, for example, saying this very bad disease against allowing a couple to have genetically related children. And then when you do that kind of comparison, of course, it might seem obvious that you should allocate the money to save the cancer patient right now. But the fact is that there's a lot of money in biological research. And the thing is that actually we need to be careful about actually how we make the comparison between these two different things going on. And then, and also related to the value of genetic parenthood or having genetically related children, I think if you're interested in that, Tina also has a fantastic paper on the value of genetic parenthood and actually saying why there is no such thing, and then talking about adoption there. But yeah, mainly that.
Okay, back to the floor, sir.
I'm Peter Sikora from Center for Bioethics in UCM, University Trnava, that's in Slovakia, and I would like to bring to the debate another, I think, compelling reason for heritable editing. This is actually, we are exploring this idea on the case of CDC together with Professor Sylvester Chima from KwaZulu University in Dunbar. And the question or the problem is partially a social value problem, but I would frame it as a public health ethics problem. And yesterday we heard a fantastic progress in somatic gene therapy, and it's on the way to be soon approved by FDA as sickle cell disease therapy, or also beta thalassemia gene therapy. And my question is that in future will change the situation in a way to actually, it will beg for the bring heritable genome editing in addition to somatic gene therapy, because applying somatic gene therapy in a more extended way in cases like sickle cell disease, which is not so rare disease, it will increase the cases of homozygous parents probability having children with sickle cell disease. So what I'm saying is that thanks to the therapy, treatment, somatic treatment, we will increase the patients for that treatment in future generation. I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, that I am against somatic gene therapy. I'm saying that the somatic gene therapy is not going to resolve it, and it has to be complemented in cases like these by heritable genome therapy.
Efrat, do you want to start maybe?
What you're saying is very interesting, and actually it's an issue that has been raised for preconception carrier screening, right? Because normally deleterious alleles in the population disappear over time because affected people who are homozygous have reduced fitness, right? They don't have as many children. And in fact, it's actually been shown, I can tell you for the Jewish population, where there's been preconception screening for Tay-Sachs since the 70s of the 20th century, there's actually a slow increase in the carrier rate because people who are both carriers either don't choose to marry, or they do not have affected children. But I think realistically, it's not going to be a real issue, because this is something that's going to take generations. And if you look at any of these technologies, and that's one of the issues of their social value, is in the end, they serve a very small proportion of the population. Even Israel, which I think has the highest rate of IVF in the world, 5% of births are through assisted reproductive technology. So that means 95% are not.
Okay, so I have a question again from Slido, and then back to the room. From Isabel Bartram: as a scientist myself, I don't understand how the risk of unwanted off-target effects in germline editing can technologically ever be completely excluded because of genetic mosaicism after CRISPR. If so, then why talk about it like it's a risk-free possibility in the near future?
I'm not an expert on gene editing, so that has to be answered. But again, it's more of a, like I said, a thought experiment. And at some point, I think it's reasonable to assume that there might be safe enough. And I just want to remind everybody that normal embryos have lots of mosaicism too. So that's another thing to remember.
Sir?
Okay, so Adam Zaretsky, I'm a doctor of bioart, representing the GAP, the Transgenic Human Germlines Alternative Project, as well as TTT Labs and the Hub of Arts Labs at the Ionian University, and BEAC, the BioArt Ethical Advisory Commission. Public understanding of heritable genome editing from a bioart perspective is best understood from hands-on experiential wet lab work with non-professionals, informal training in the making of transgenic embryos. And this would involve like ovum acquisition, cryogenics, CRISPR genome, infectious construct design, embryo grading, understanding, implantation, and selective reduction. All of this hands-on as much as possible for the public and for artists and for philosophers and STS people, because most commentary doesn't have any experiential value. Can you see the educational worth of human genome editing zygotes? Say in the lobby here at the CRIC, at the next meeting, wherever we have it, can we have a microinjector and inject a sperm into an egg? Like, let people do it hands-on with a CRISPR construct, and maybe even wait a couple of days and then ace them, like bleach them or put them on ice or whatever. Can we have hands-on human genome heritable editing for the sake of experiential bioethical debate?
Robin is already planning this for the next meeting. I can see him nodding there.
Are you going to donate the sperm?
Absolutely, yeah, I'm in.
Any comments from the panelists? Okay, well, the one thing I will say is that in the context of the preparation for my book, I actually did go and try to do this in the context of using mouse materials, not human materials. But it was actually very interesting to actually even just understand that this is a game for young people, because the specificity of trying to hold on to, with your foot, hold on to the egg, and with your hands try to move the sperm into the embryo. Anyhow, I think that your point is well taken, that it does give you a different perspective on any contested issue if you actually have some experiential knowledge. But I'm not sure that that's going to happen in the near future. Thank you for your comment.
Hi there. I was surprised that the discussion of treatment immediately jumped to the next generation. Presumably, there are a significant number of people who have a genetic condition that prevents them making gametes. So many of these options aren't available, and they would require genome editing to allow them to make a sperm or an egg. And those people have a medical condition, infertility, which has serious effects for many. And on the male side, there's people traveling all around Europe to try and find someone who will find a sperm that isn't there. So that seems both a comment on the one of the actual more common needs for genome editing, but also on this idea of treatment.
Anyway, this isn't working, but so you're talking about presently infertile people who need gene editing in order to have workable gametes. That's what, just to make sure I understand. Yes. Yeah, my talk doesn't really touch somatic therapy, even if it's somatic germline therapy or some combination of it.
That's germline therapy though, still.
Right, so that's why I was really clear that I'm talking about reproductive genome modification and not heritability or germline, because you do have cases of existing people where maybe you want to do modifications that affect the germline. And that's therapeutic as far as I'm concerned. That's not the same thing that I'm talking about, which is the editing of gametes or embryos in order to create new people.
I would argue absolutely is reproductive heritable germline editing. It can't be, by definition, it is. And I think it really impacts your argument, because the way you speak about it, the language you use, I think is probably quite, difficult for people with those conditions to hear.
So therapies that affect existing individuals and improve their health or their fertility, on the assumption that fertility is health related, has therapeutic value, and nothing I've said has challenged that. What I'm challenging is whether the creation of people who whose existence is not inevitable in the first place has therapeutic value. So this is an interesting blend case because you're both treating an existing adult with infertility so that they can create new people. And I would say treating the existing person with a medical need has important value.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important need that's essentially ignored and defined out of your paper, I would argue, and the arguments you've used.
Yeah, thank you for the addition. I don't think it challenges the core foundation of my argument, but it's an important addition to consider. Thank you.
Well, most of my comments have already been made, really, by now. But
so then I should ask you to.
Well, I've got to say a bit more. So I'm not sure Tina was understanding that it could be the defect is in the germline. So you are correcting the germline to allow the fertility. So the offspring will carry that edit. So just make it clear. Yeah. And then, okay, in the UK, couples seeking IVF are referred to as patients. It's International Women's Day, and of course the women is bearing the burden of this treatment to allow them to have children, right? And so you imagine, and this is the point that was raised earlier, you imagine a patient who has received somatic genome editing to cure a disease. They have experienced what it's like to have a disease, have the therapy. They want to have children who are not going to inherit that disease. They are going to, rather than having them to go through the same process of suffering from disease initially and then having the therapy, the incentive for them to undergo germline gene editing to avoid having a child with a genetic disease is going to be very strong. So that you're going to have to deal with that, not now, but in the future. And that future, if everything works, is only 20 years away, right? So it's not that long. And just another little point that's been forgotten. In normal reproduction, there are new mutations occurring all the time. I'm an older father. The risk of my children having some mutation is double that of a younger father, right? So just don't forget that. So reproduction is a dangerous business already.
So I'm actually going to take a comment from the Slido only because it's directly on point, and it actually then makes for interesting ways of thinking that we're actually having a conversation amongst each other, not just between the panelists and the audience. That comment is from Alberto Aparicio that says, seems like most of the summit discussions take for granted biological parenthood as the preferred choice, but this is cultural and should be examined in light of ongoing conversations. So I'm just offering that up as a comment, and I think we also had that from you, Fred, at the beginning, right? In a pronatalist society, you're going to have a different kind of set of starting assumptions.
And it was important for me to mention that I don't personally ascribe to that, but I can give an example of this. In Israel, there was a whole discussion about whether to allow social sex selection, which is, by the way, very common in Arab countries. And there was a whole discussion about whether or not to do it and what the process would be. And there were two very prominent ethicists who said, there's a lot of literature about this from Europe, that people, when they want to do sex selection, it's for what's called family balancing. They want to have females as well as they have males. So I hate to say this on International Women's Day, but I said, well, maybe you guys live in Europe, but I live in Jerusalem, and that's the Middle East. And I can tell you that if we ever allow social sex selection, I can tell you what sex people are going to want. 90% of the time, they're going to want males. And they said no. And there is a process in Israel. Now, I won't get into all the gory details of it, but there are very limited ways of asking for a sex selection for non-medical reasons. And I was off by 3%. It's only 87% males, not 90%. So I think we have to be cognizant, and I think, of the fact that biological parenthood is still an imperative, and in some major religions, it's even the only parenthood possible. And I don't think we can really ignore that.
Can I jump in there and say something? Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Oh yeah, good. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. So I think it's important also to stress that this particular panel, we were thinking about if there are compelling reasons for heritable human genome editing, and Efra, Tina, and I presented different arguments and different positions. And one of the things that has come up in the question is that, of course, people are interested not only in these three particular arguments, but also in all other arguments and actually objections, for example, to germline genome editing. But the fact to stress here is that from the actual instance that we didn't discuss all the issues, that doesn't mean that actually we do not know about them, or actually we don't think that they are important. So for example, yeah, so Tina talked about the societal value. I talk about if they actually are therapeutic or not. And people are saying, oh, well, but how about safety? How about that? Well, I think in that particular case, yes, those are questions that actually are not addressing our particular presentations. And that's important because, of course, it seems that here some of the people asking questions, we're talking past each other because they are not actually engaging with the type of argument that we are presenting. And that's something that I think is relevant to do when actually you are engaging with something like this. Because of course, for example, I think there's tons of things to say about the social value of genome editing. And then, yeah, but things about risk might not be particularly well pointed towards that direction. Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to point out that we're actually at the end of the coffee break, so I hope those of you who wanted coffee have done that. I'm sorry, I know somebody else has just joined the line, but there were two speakers, and I'm only going to take those two speakers, and I'm going to ask you both to ask your questions, and then we're going to deal with it. No, I've been told one. Okay. I'm going to be fired from this job. It's not going to happen again. George, can I ask you to give way to a participant as you're on the planning committee? Oh, he's not happy with that either. Okay. All right, I'm going to override Robin
while
and
we're
get
silencing
both questions,
lots of
please.
voices, of course.
No.
I'll accept being silent.
Please, just say your questions and we'll allow the panelists to do that.
I think it's very important, as a member of the planning committee, to express deep discomfort in the excessive dependence on social value as the driver for allocation of resources in research and clinical care. As a physician, I'm deeply concerned that the needs of individuals need to be heard. And we have heard from those individuals at this meeting. And the fact is, we have also heard that rare diseases are indeed rare, but in the collective, there is an enormous human burden from rare diseases. And if we only allocate our resources to those conditions that are common among the public, we will be ignoring an enormous percentage of the population who suffer and carry a deep disease burden. I would also say that from the scientific perspective, we're not particularly good at predicting the ultimate long-term public benefit of an intervention. Many profoundly important medical technologies have emerged from a focus on very rare diseases. Much of the gene therapy that we're talking about today, which has been enabled, really has been because of treating these incredibly rare conditions, and now are being amplified to be able to treat more common conditions like sickle cell and cancer and the like. So I just want to speak strongly from the perspective of, no, I'm making a comment. Okay. I want to speak very strongly that if we only allocate resources based on the most common, we are going to be ignoring the most, many of the important voices we've heard at this conference. Anyway.
I appreciate that comment. I appreciate that comment and tried to be very clear in what I said. And if I wasn't, I want to clarify. I'm not a maximizer. I don't think resources should only be allocated to common diseases. I said resources should be allocated on these grounds: commonality or severity. And rare diseases are very severe. The thing is, not being able to have genetically related children is about a preference. It's not a disease. And so when you have a small number of people affected by something that is not a disease, that's not in the same status as a rare disease. And we have to make tough choices. There are people out there who are dying from their diseases, and their treatments aren't being funded, and their voices aren't here.
Okay, can we have the last question? And it really is the last question.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Callum McKellar from the Scottish Council on Human Bioethics. About 30 years ago, one of my first bioethics workshops was with Robert Edwards and Anne McLaren, and we were looking at fertility treatment. Right at the end of the workshop, I asked the question, all this is only really interesting or really motivating for fertility treatment is because people want children of their own. And I said, well, why do most people, not everyone, but most people want children of their own? And everybody just smiled, and there was a silence. And that's 30 years ago. And I'm still asking myself the question. Of course, there's large parts like in Israel, in many Muslim countries, and even in the UK, where people want children of their own. And that is what is motivating the HFEA. The existence of the HFEA is often motivating heritable genome editing. But people still do not know why. Is it an instinct? Is it to pass on your name? Why? And I've got just one very short story. We were doing some work.
Sorry, I can't let you
Okay,
start a short story. If you have a question, but otherwise, I'm already going to be fired, so thank you.
I think the reason is very simple. It's called evolution. And I think we're evolutionarily programmed to pass on our genes. It might be our only important function in life if we think about it very narrowly.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for their indulgence. I want to apologize again to the original speakers for the interruptions and invite Robin.
Well, just to say thank you, thank you, Francois, for chairing a session and fantastic speaking. 10 minutes, no more, coffee break. All right? So we're...
Sorry. Right.
We got a little abbreviated,
Yeah.
but I assume everything's going to be fine.
Everything should be fine. Let's check.
I think it's one of these things. It's almost like. Ability.
In many markets, the oxytocin is not. Thanks for that. Cost and availability.
Oh, hey, Megan. Watch my,
When 12 boys come banging down,
yeah,
fireworks,
you know,
fire
that's
alarm.
what I'm talking about, trying to connect.
I just wanted to make sure I introduce myself because I do follow your work. And yeah, I know. Yeah. Have you? Is this the first? It is. It seems like there are a lot of various initiatives like in the US that are also represented here. Yeah. They're in various capacities. Yeah. And did you have good feedback to your Yeah, I think people are excited about that. Yeah. Yeah. Is that, I mean, is that like,
Worried that the might
Oh, I think it was Matt. It was Matt.
Can I move the bus?
Yes.
Yeah. That's fine.
Can you ring the bell? Yeah, Louise, let the record know. Not.
Yeah, no, I have the idea.
From a like benchmarking. Do you feel like there's like
Yes.
But how does, I mean, I feel like that's, does that sort of fall, I mean, obviously conceptualize like bespoke, or is that sort of? No, it is. Yeah, I would say so.
Well, very, I think it led to a good discussion. It's just more. I am at the moment trying to integrate. I had a plan
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense. Do you, I mean, are you, and I know that, you know, everybody's. Delivery size specifically with regard to like tissue tropism as opposed to like phenotype, like but even with manufacturing, time and it was really nice to meet you in person. And
Thank you for tracking me down.
yeah, no, and I'm around.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your interest too. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right.
Bye, Joey.
That's a better way to put it. And I think that's right. And I think, you know,
To get rid of like.
yeah, but that was my mistake. That's what I think. Right?
You know about yes. Yeah. Hi, Anna. Good to see you.
Welcome back, everyone. Sorry, we need to get going. Otherwise, you won't get any lunch break either. So a few comments have been made. Why didn't we have this session, talking about heritable genome editing early in the summit? Well, it's because we actually wanted to shift the focus, which, remember, in Hong Kong was pretty much entirely, for reasons beyond our control, on heritable genome editing. We wanted to switch the focus to somatic genome editing, which I think we did very well, which is why we had the first 2 days on that. But of course, this topic does raise lots of issues, and so just remember that this is not the end of any discussion. You will have plenty of opportunities to discuss that whole area in the future. But let's get this session underway. So this is the update on science and techniques of editing of gametes, which of course is one potential way of having heritable genome editing, but there are other reasons for doing this. So anyway, Howie Rang is going to be chairing the session. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's a very tough session to follow. There's really exciting, interesting discussions. I just want to take an opportunity to say one thing. I think we heard a lot from the last couple of years about the limited resource of somatic editing and how we allocate the funding for somatic versus heritable. I just think maybe I'm a dreamer, but I want to say to every one of you and the one who's watching this, we should try our best to build collaboration and friendship across the international community instead of hostility, so that our government can spend less money to build the weapon, kill each other, to put the money to save more people, okay? So in that case, we don't have to argue so much about which disease to cure versus other to allocate the funding. My name is Haoyu Wang, and I'm from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. I'm working on genome editing and cell therapy. So today it's very fortunately we have 4 outstanding scientists in this field, and they will introduce the editing of the gametes. I want to highlight one thing. Those research are not intended to make any pregnancy in human. So it's in the basic research area, and also those research are not only for making heritable genome editing possible. It's really for understanding a lot of the human early development as well as the gamete development in human. So with no further ado, now Amanda are going to give us the overview about this field.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Howie, for the introduction. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Amanda Clark, and I'm a professor at the University of California in Los Angeles, and I'm also the director of a new Center for Reproductive Science, Health, and Education at UCLA, and this center is designed to have the conversations at the intersection of new reproductive technologies as well as social sciences. So similar to the kinds of conversations we're having today, which are extremely important and timely. So what I'm going to do is look for this pointer, laser pointer. Okay. So what I've been asked to do is essentially to give an overview. So I'm not going to talk much at all about my own science, but I'm going to bring it up a little bit because it's a good opportunity to do that. So instead, I want to return here, which is where we were in 2020 with the publication of this consensus report on heritable human genome editing by the National Academy of Medicine, National Academy of Sciences, and the British Royal Society. So we've already discussed this consensus report over the last 2 days, but I want to bring it up here as the starting place for where I'm going to begin the discussion today. So this report had 11 recommendations, and in one of those recommendations, it was the pathway forward for the initial clinical uses of heritable human genome editing. And so what the committee was very clear about is part of their deliberations did not involve a substantial effort placed on societal considerations. It was beyond the Commission's remit. I would argue that moving forward, it would be important to start bringing in societal considerations to the initial uses of heritable human genome editing as the possibility gets closer. So the clinical path for the initial uses, so this is not about all uses of heritable human genome editing, but it's the initial uses, that first use that is going to be discussed and contemplated for human heritable genome editing. So the Commission had decided that the initial uses, their recommendations are that it should be limited to serious monogenic diseases. And if you dig down into the report a little bit more, they actually give some examples of serious monogenic diseases. But in the recommendation summary itself, it was diseases that cause severe morbidity or premature death. But deeper in it, the examples are things like sickle cell disease, we've talked about that so far, as well as Huntington's disease, cystic fibrosis, and the list goes on. That the initial uses of heritable human genome editing should be limited to changing a known pathogenic variant, so a sequence that's common in the relevant population. And I thought that this was actually a really terrific comment. As we've learned today in this meeting, if you were not aware before, there's significant variation in genomes based on ancestry. And so thinking about changing the variant to a known variant in the relevant population, I think is an incredibly important point. That gene editing should not be used on embryos without the disease-causing phenotype. So you shouldn't be editing embryos that don't have the disease. I think that makes sense. And that now talking about prospective parents, and I think this is really important. These are ultimately the individuals who are making the decisions about heritable human genome editing for future children. So for prospective parents, this should be limited to those parents with an extremely high risk for transmitting the serious monogenic disease to their biological child. And these are the circumstances by which the committee recommended. So this would be for prospective parents that have no options. And we've heard about a few of these examples today. These are couples that generate limited number of embryos, and all of the embryos are carrying the monogenic disease mutation. Or for those individuals that have extremely poor options. And so for those of you who work in the fertility, infertility world of science, like I do, like my colleagues do, there are a number of individuals who make very, very few embryos. And if you've only got 2 embryos to choose from, and one of them carries the disease phenotype and the other one doesn't, it's highly likely what the other one that doesn't may not lead to a biological child. And so extremely poor options would be involved in that as well. So the way that heritable human genome editing is discussed is in the frame of editing an embryo. And so this is a beautiful picture of a human zygote. It's a fertilized egg. You can see the 2 pronuclei, which are the male and female DNA, which are in these circles here, if you're not used to looking at this under the microscope. So heritable genome editing, as it's been discussed in prior meetings, is talking about the editing of the fertilized embryo and beyond, so after fertilization has occurred. There are significant challenges, technical challenges, scientific challenges to editing embryos, as well as societal challenges to discuss. One of them is that significant cohorts of human embryos are going to be required for testing the editing tools that are going to be used to edit these embryos. And the committee recommends that there should be 4 criteria that must be met before the editing tool is then used for editing embryos for heritable human genome editing. And these are the 4 recommendations. That the editing must first be confirmed using embryos for research, not intended for transfer and reproductive purposes, but using human embryos to confirm the intended edit at the targets. That makes sense. To confirm genomic variation is similar to unedited embryos. This is really important, and it was brought up this morning that there's a lot of heterogeneity amongst the genome of the cells of a pre-implantation embryo. And that's because the breaks for DNA replication are off in a lot of early human embryo development. And so therefore it's expected the repair pathways are likely different. And so consequently, different cells of an embryo have different genomes, so they're acquiring different genetic changes. And this occurs naturally, whether it's occurring in the body during natural reproduction or in the lab, in the IVF lab as well. So there will be genetic variation, that's to be expected. We don't want there to be any more genetic variation with the technique of editing. There needs to be documentation that there's no evidence of mosaicism, this is a recommendation, and to also confirm aneuploidy rates are similar to unedited embryos. There's also a lot of aneuploidy in human embryos, and that aneuploidy increases with the age of the person who's donated the oocyte as part of this process. So only once all of these are met and the tool is verified as being safe and efficacious, it can then be used to edit the embryo that's intended for reproductive purposes, and a biopsy is then performed at the blastocyst stage in order to confirm that all of these criteria have been met in the embryo intended for transfer. So that's a lot of criteria to meet using embryos for research purposes. So what I want to talk about, and what this session is about, is heritable human genome editing prior to fertilization. So editing gametes and precursors to gametes. And I'm going to specifically talk about editing precursors to gametes. And why is this an interesting technology to consider as part of heritable human genome editing? The first is that precursors to gametes can be cultured in the lab, ex vivo, and that means that they are amenable to monitoring efficiency and the precision of the edit, those 4 criteria, before even making an embryo. And this also will avoid the issue of mosaicism, because the precursor germ cells that have been characterized fully for carrying the edit and not having off targets and not having increased genome variation, when these precursors ultimately make the gamete will be carrying the edited DNA. What this means is that fewer embryos will be used to test the edit. The gamete with the confirmed edit is then used for heritable human genome editing, and the biopsy that's performed at the blastocyst stage will confirm the edit and should provide relatively high confidence that the edit has occurred in all cells. So again, going back to the diminishing expectations of mosaicism. So now I need to bring up the germline. So germline is my area of expertise. I'm a basic scientist. I am interested in the cell and molecular biology of germline formation, the cell and molecular decisions that will make a germline cell versus a somatic cell. That's where my research sits. So I show this kind of slide a lot. This is a cycle of the germline. Heritable human gene editing occurs in these stages. This is what's been previously discussed, starting from the fertilized egg, which is the zygote, which is the more typical time when heritable human genome editing tools are being assessed today. And so what I'm going to be talking about, these are the gametes, the egg and the sperm. What I'm going to talk about is precursors that sit on this side of the germline cycle for editing purposes. So there are 2 potential accessible places of germline precursors that could be used in order to develop the technology for heritable human genome editing. So one of them is by editing spermatogonial stem cells, which come from individuals who have testes, because spermatogonial stem cells can be cultured ex vivo. So this is one potential access point prior to embryo formation where genome editing could occur. However, you'll notice I've only pointed to the testis. So there's thought to be no equivalent population in the ovary of ovarian stem cells that could be cultured ex vivo for genome editing purposes. The other place that's accessible in the germline for heritable human genome editing is cells that come from blastocysts. So the derivation of stem cells from blastocysts or patient-specific equivalents, which are more relevant to the conversation we're having today. These are the two current precursors to gametes that are relevant for this conversation. So I'm going to begin with the adult testis, and my colleague, Professor Carl Orwig, will talk more about this in his talk today. The testis is a site of a stem cell, an adult stem cell population called spermatogonial stem cells. These are germline cells, and these are the stem cells in the tubules. So these little lines are pointing to what would be spermatogonial stem cells that are responsible for making sperm throughout a man's lifetime. These are incredibly rare cells. They can be isolated using proteins found on the surface of these spermatogonial cells. However, the conditions for self-renewal have not been fully optimized. So although it's possible to isolate spermatogonia to get them growing a little bit in culture, it's not possible to culture them ex vivo for long periods of time, the periods of time that would be necessary in humans for being able to test editing tools. So the other precursor to gametes in the germline are pluripotent stem cells. When I first started my scientific career at UCSF, this was the only type of pluripotent stem cell that was possible. These were human embryonic stem cells that were derived from blastocysts that had been consented to research and used for the derivation of new embryonic stem cell lines. So of course, these are not the types of pluripotent cells that would be used for heritable human genome editing. Instead, they make great biomedical tools to understand early human germline development. Then in 2006, Shinya Yamanaka, using mouse fibroblast cells, developed the technology for starting with a somatic cell and then using molecular biology tools, demonstrate it was possible to reprogram them to a cell that was coined an induced pluripotent stem cell, and that these induced pluripotent stem cells were very similar in their functional capacity as well as their identity to embryonic stem cells. About 18 months later, it was shown by 3 independent groups, of which one of them was George Daly, the other was Shinya Yamanaka, and the third was James Thompson, that it's possible to achieve induced reprogramming, starting with somatic cells to make human-induced pluripotent stem cells. And that completely transformed what stem cell scientists were able to do with stem cell technologies today. So if we're going to be talking about heritable human genome editing and a precursor to the germline, it's the beginning with human-induced pluripotent stem cells. So the differentiation of gametes in vitro in the lab from pluripotent stem cells is called in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG. So you're going to hear me talk about IVG from now on. It's shortened for in vitro gametogenesis, the generation of gametes in vitro. In vitro gametogenesis is currently used today, but not for reproductive purposes. In vitro gametogenesis is used to generate new fundamental knowledge on the human germline and early embryo development. That's the sort of research that my lab does. It is used to understand the molecular basis of germline errors. It's also highly used to understand the molecular basis of human infertility. So this is biomedical research. It's also used, again, in biomedical research, but also in screening to understand the effects of infectious agents on the germline, infection of the germline. Reproductive toxicology, in vitro gametogenesis, is used to understand effects of toxins on the germline. For those of you who aren't aware, in the US, 80,000 chemicals are registered for use in the US, but the EPA, which monitors this stuff, has only actually looked at the safety of 350 of them. And so therefore, we need tools to be able to understand effects of chemicals and the environment around us on cells in the body, including our germline cells. And of course, in vitro gametogenesis can also be used for contraception discovery, so new non-hormonal contraceptives, so that expand choice for women. So what gave me pause yesterday was this is in vitro gametogenesis, in vitro, differentiating germline cells in vitro. A lot of this biomedical research and screening actually uses CRISPR. So we're using CRISPR in order to create cell lines that have reporters in them, edits to do functional genomics. So what gave me pause yesterday was this slide from Francois, which is that there are current policies on human germline genome editing, not for reproductive purposes. So my question is, when we look at some of these policies, how much of that is actually scooping up some of the fundamental basic research that we're doing on differentiating gametes in vitro and using gene editing in biomedical research? So I'd be very curious to dig into this a little bit more. But today we're here to talk about in vitro gametogenesis for reproductive purposes and the place that it potentially might play in this technology if it was ever to make it to the clinic. So for reproductive purposes, in vitro gametogenesis is used for under circumstances of gamete loss that you don't even need an edit at that point. If you don't make a gamete, if you're medically infertile, you have a disease of infertility and you don't make a gamete, you have no medical options. In vitro gametogenesis is your only option because gametes are the only cell types that are capable of passing DNA on from one generation to the next. If you make a non-functional gamete, assisted reproductive technologies today also cannot help you either. So in vitro gametogenesis fits that hole. And I should say infertility is not necessarily a rare disease. It's estimated by the World Health Organization that 185 million people around the world suffer from infertility at any given time. So infertility is not necessarily rare. So it's unfortunate that it's thought that it is. Heritable human genome editing has the possibility of being able to help an infertile person with a monogenic disease that's the cause of their infertility. So, for example, diseases that are in monogenic, so mutations in genes that are responsible for meiosis, they can lead to the disease of infertility. So that's a potential spot where a heritable human genome editing could be used to correct that mutation to therefore enable gametogenesis to move forward in the production of sperm. So how does in vitro gametogenesis work? It involves starting with somatic cells that are taken from a patient. iPS cells are made from those somatic cells, and then the germline is made through in vitro gametogenesis, starting with this cell type called a primordial germ cell-like cell. You'll hear about that a lot, which is the first step in vitro gametogenesis before making spermatogonia, oocytes, and sperm. IVG is based on sequential developmental events. So if we're starting with female cells or male cells, and when I say female and male here, I mean biological sex, not gender. So if we start with female cells and male cells, the process of making gametes essentially follows the same fundamental steps that are occurring during natural germline development during the life cycle. And so these steps of IVG, making an oocyte and a sperm, have been achieved in animal models, and you're going to hear from experts in the field who have achieved this technology using the biomedical research tool, the mouse. So I'm going to do a spoiler that in humans, it's possible to get this far with in vitro gametogenesis. It is possible to get to the point of making human oogonia in the lab, as well as fetal spermatogonia in the lab. So the next parts are engineering challenges that the field is working on. So I just want to end on a few little things. So something to keep aware is with in vitro gametogenesis from pluripotent stem cells, the way we generally assess genomic integrity in pluripotent stem cells before we perform our experiments is to perform a karyotype. And so we are constantly performing karyotypes in our human pluripotent stem cells in the lab. So this is a karyotype from cells from the karyotype from some of our iPS cells that are taken from women of known fertility status, and our iPS cells are karyotypically normal and female as expected. But what we were interested in this study was to look deeper into the genome at subkaryotypic resolution to look at genomic changes, because this impacts the use of in vitro gametogenesis for reproductive purposes, the amount of mutations that they acquire during the process of making iPS cells. And so basically what we showed in our work using iPS cells from women of known fertility status is very consistent with what the field knows about iPS cells, in that they acquire mutations during the process of generating iPS cells from their somatic cells. And in some cell lines, the mutation load is very high. It's over 300,000. That iPS line would never be used to make a gamete for reproductive purposes. But we have some iPS cell lines that have very, very low mutational load as a consequence of generating iPS cells, which is bringing it into the order of magnitude of the natural mutation load that happens in the germline in the body. So we know that it's about 60. It varies with age, but there are about 60 new acquired mutations that are occurring during the natural process of reproduction in the germline. So we expect this to be the case in vitro. Societal views on IVG are just starting to emerge as well, and the peer-reviewed published literature. There was this really interesting study that was published relatively recently, surveying the Belgian population. It was a survey of 1,000 people. 68% of respondents had a positive attitude towards IVG. The very small number of individuals they captured who suffered from infertility demonstrated that if you're talking to a stakeholder, they have even more favorable views of in vitro gametogenesis. So that was around 77%. In this particular paper, respondents were asked about heritable human genome editing in the context of IVG. So this is what we're talking about today. And in Belgium, in this survey, around 43% of people approved of a genetic intervention with IVG for a medically devastating condition. And interestingly, 34% did not. So there's a big missing gap there. And that missing gap is knowledge, is that people didn't know how to answer that question because they were missing key knowledge. And we've had a conversation about that today as well. Finally, Belgium is not the rest of the world. Belgium is definitely not the US. And so we at UCLA, as part of our center, are also collecting societal views on in vitro gametogenesis. We're not beginning with a survey. The PI of this project is Hannah Landecker, and her postdoc Anne Legoff is leading it. But we are actually starting with the stakeholders to figure out what questions do you have about in vitro gametogenesis that you would like answered through focus groups. And so we're talking to those individuals that have infertility. And we're also talking to another stakeholder, which is the LGBTQ+ community, who tend to be high users of assisted reproductive technologies in order to have a family. So with that, I'm going to summarize the advantages and disadvantages of in vitro gametogenesis in order to be a tool for human heritable genome editing. The advantages are that the intended edit at the targets can be confirmed in iPS cells prior to IVG and avoids mosaicism in the resulting embryos. And the gametes are patient-specific to the intended parents. And as we've heard, for some people, that's extremely important to have a biological child rather than using alternate options, which is adoption or gamete donation. Disadvantages are that the genome changes that I've shown you, genome changes emerge during iPS generation, even prior to germline precursor differentiation. So understanding these and minimizing them needs to be better understood before this would ever make it into the clinic. Also, the generation of an IVG-derived gamete has also not yet been achieved, but I imagine it will in the coming years. And safety for IVG for reproductive purposes first needs to be established before even considering this technology for heritable human genome editing. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much. I look forward to questions later.
Well, while I get my pointer, I'd like to add my thanks to Robin and Johnny and the other organizers for inviting me to attend this meeting. And also, I'm happy to be able to share the stage with both friends and colleagues in science who I enjoy very much, not just here at this meeting, but continuously. So my lab has been doing germline gene editing for a long time, over 20 years, not for the purpose of heritable human genome editing, but because we're interested in genes and their functions, and we've been able to manipulate the germline of animals for a long time. But that all changed actually when I attended and presented in the 2015 meeting of this group because I began to hear a lot about what was known and what wasn't known, and came away inspired to do basic translational and preclinical research that would generate data that could be employed as we have a societal and ethical discussion about gene therapy, gene editing in general, and specifically in the germline. Well, in my lab, we focus on one of those germline precursor cells that Amanda introduced, and that's the spermatogonial stem cell that's at the foundation of spermatogenesis and gives rise to the entire spermatogenic lineage, including the terminally differentiated